thick, sticky fog, as if saturated with the anticipation of something inevitable, covered the valley of the River Somme like a heavy blanket on the night of August 8, 1918. This whitish shroud, concealing the shell-pocked land of Picardy, seemed unnatural, almost mystical, as if nature itself had decided to lower the curtain before the start of a grand drama. In this viscous silence, disturbed only by an occasional splash of water or the rustle of wind in the remnants of charred trees, lurked a tension that seemed to make the very air hum. Usually, before an offensive of such magnitude, the horizon would blaze with flashes, and the earth would tremble from days of artillery preparation, warning the enemy of the coming blow weeks, if not months, in advance. This was the law of attrition warfare. First, you destroy fortifications. Then you send men to attack. But this time, the horizon remained dark and silent. Not a single shot, not a single flare. Only a strange, low, vibrating hum came from the western side, but even that was drowned out by the noise of specially launched aircraft circling over German positions with monotonous persistence. In this pre-dawn gloom, permeated by dampness and the smell of rusty iron, the fate of not just one operation, but of the entire global conflict that had tormented Europe for 4 infinitely long years was being decided. The Canadian Corps, the elite strike force of the British Empire, had achieved the impossible. They had moved into position in complete silence, under the cover of night, replacing the exhausted Australian units literally in the last hours before dawn. It was a logistical symphony played in complete darkness. Thousands of men, hundreds of guns, tons of ammunition moved like ghosts, so that German intelligence, accustomed to reading the enemy's intentions from the slightest movement, remained in the dark. The command took an unprecedented risk. Soldiers were forbidden even to smoke, so that the light of a match would not betray their presence. Officers whispered their final orders, checking the readiness of men whose faces were hidden by gas mask bags and helmets. This was an all-in gamble, a stake that exceeded all conceivable limits. For failure, a breach of camouflage or premature detection could mean the final loss of initiative and the indefinite prolongation of the bloody confrontation, which an exhausted Europe might no longer be able to bear. 4 years of positional deadlock had taught the generals a caution bordering on paranoia. But the situation in the summer of 1918 demanded decisions that went beyond conventional logic. The German army, which in the spring still seemed an invincible machine capable of reaching Paris and dictating its peace terms, had exhausted itself in a series of its own furious but strategically fruitless offensives, known as the Ludendorff Offensive. Imperial troops stretched across an enormous front suffered from a severe lack of resources, and most importantly, a lack of belief in ultimate success. The naval blockade slowly but surely strangled the economies of the Central Powers. Hunger prevailed in German cities, and on the continent, thousands of fresh American soldiers landed daily, full of energy and determination, unfamiliar with the horrors of Verdun and the Somme. The balance of power shifted inexorably, like sand in an hourglass, and the Allied command under Marshal Ferdinand Foch realized the brief moment had come for a blow that would not simply push the enemy back a couple of kilometers, but would break his back. The plan for the operation near Amiens, conceived at the headquarters of the British Fourth Army under General Henry Rawlinson, was audacious and innovative. Rawlinson, a man who had personally experienced the bitterness of failures and the cost of frontal assaults, managed to learn lessons from the tragedy on the Somme 2 years prior. He understood that the key to victory lay not in massed infantry thrown against machine guns, but in technology and surprise. The plan was based on abandoning preliminary artillery preparation, which always revealed the point of attack. Instead, the focus was placed on science. Using the latest methods of sound ranging and flash spotting, British specialists managed to create a precise map of German artillery positions without firing a single ranging shot. Mathematics and physics replaced brute force, allowing a blind strike to be delivered with surgical precision. Precisely at 4:20 in the morning, when the darkness was densest and the sentries' sleep deepest, the silence was torn by an inhuman, apocalyptic roar. This was not a gradual buildup of fire, it was an instantaneous, synchronized strike of 2,000 guns, unleashing a storm of fire and steel on German batteries, command posts, and communication nodes. The sky instantly turned crimson, and the earth trembled as if from an earthquake. German artillerymen, caught off guard in their dugouts, did not even have time to reach their gun carriages before their positions were engulfed in a sea of fire. Shells fell with terrifying accuracy, turning guns into heaps of twisted metal and crews into memories. Simultaneously, like steel monsters from ancient myths, reanimated and eager for battle, hundreds of heavy Mark V tanks emerged from the fog. There were over 400 of them, and they moved not as timid infantry support, as had been the case before, but as the spearhead, breaking through wire entanglements and grinding down machine gun nests that had for years been considered impregnable. The effect of surprise was absolute, paralyzing the will. German defenses, built up over years according to principles of deep echelonment, crumbled in the very first minutes, not even having time to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. The dense fog, which could have been an obstacle for the attackers, became their best ally, concealing the true number of attacking forces and the direction of the main strikes. Wehrmacht officers, waking up to the roar of explosions, found that their headquarters were already surrounded, telephone lines cut, and communication with the front completely absent. Chaos, all-consuming and merciless, engulfed the German lines. Orders did not reach their addressees. Reserves moved into emptiness or fell under the dagger-like fire of tank machine guns, appearing where they were least expected. This was not merely a breakthrough of the front, it was a systemic collapse, the destruction of the Army's very nervous system. On the external visible layer of events, the triumph of mechanized warfare over outdated tactics of infantry waves and static defense unfolded. Tanks, aviation, artillery, and infantry acted as a single coordinated organism, controlled by an invisible but firm hand from headquarters. Royal Air Force planes, buzzing in the sky like a swarm of agitated wasps, not only conducted reconnaissance and adjusted fire, but also dropped smoke bombs, blinding German gunners, and daringly descended, raking retreating columns with machine gun fire. For the first time in history, aviation began to deliver ammunition to frontline units, dropping crates of cartridges directly onto captured positions. This was a symphony of destruction, where each instrument entered at the right moment, creating an insurmountable wave of pressure. The speed of the Allied advance was phenomenal for positional warfare. By noon, Australian and Canadian divisions had advanced 12 kilometers deep into German defenses, a distance for every meter of which, in previous years, thousands of lives and months of exhausting battles had been paid. Captured German field kitchens, where breakfast was still being cooked for soldiers who were already prisoners or had fled, stood as surreal monuments to the suddenness of this blow. However, behind the facade of brilliant military success lay a profound internal conflict, a drama tearing at the souls of participants on both sides of the front. For Entente soldiers, this offensive became a test of their faith's strength, an ordeal for spirits thinned by years of hopelessness. Years of sitting in trenches, knee-deep in icy water, amidst rats and the smell of decay, had bred deep cynicism. Hope seemed a dangerous illusion. But when they saw how those very invincible German regiments, which had terrorized them for years, now fled, throwing down their weapons, or massively raised their hands, something changed in the very structure of their consciousness. An intoxicating feeling emerged that an end to this nightmare was possible, that it was tangible, that it could be reached by hand. It was an awakening from a long, heavy sleep. On the other side of the front line, a true psychological catastrophe was unfolding. The German soldier, exhausted by poor nutrition, turnips had become the main dish, tormented by news of hunger and the suffering of families in the rear, suddenly realized the utter futility of his sacrifices. The sight of hundreds of steel giants relentlessly crawling across the fields, oblivious to rifle fire, became the final straw, shattering the myth of German weapons superiority and the genius of its command. The fear of the unknown, of these soulless machines spewing death, proved stronger than the oath, stronger than the iron discipline instilled over centuries. It was on this day, August 8th, that a breaking point occurred, which General Erich Ludendorff would later bitterly call the Black Day of the German Army. Soldiers retreating in panic shouted insults at fresh units trying to advance to the front, calling them scabs and war prolongers. It was a rebellion not against officers, but against the very idea of continuing the fight. This internal breakdown also penetrated the highest echelons, into the headquarters adorned with maps and portraits of the emperor. Ludendorff, the de facto dictator of military Germany, a man with nerves of steel and the mind of a chess player, fell into a state close to panic. Receiving one report after another that entire divisions were surrendering without a fight and artillery was abandoned to its fate, he understood that the instrument on which the empire's power rested was irrevocably broken. This was a conflict between the professional pride of a commander, accustomed to operating divisions like pawns, and the harsh reality that screamed, "The war is lost." Not on maps, where hundreds of kilometers of occupied French and Belgian territory still remained, but in the minds and hearts of people. To acknowledge this meant destroying his entire world, the entire value system of Prussian militarism. For Allied generals such as Sir Douglas Haig and the Australian John Monash, this was a moment of truth of a different kind. Confirmation of the correctness of their calculations, justification for the enormous resources invested in new tactics, and proof that intelligence could defeat brute force. At a deep ideological level, the Battle of Amiens was a grand clash of two historical eras. The receding 19th century, with its romantic cavalry charges, cult of the bayonet, and belief in the spirit of the offensive. And the approaching 20th century, the century of machines, impersonal industrial power, and cold mathematical calculation. Germany, despite its technical innovations at the beginning of the war, found itself, by 1918, trapped by outdated dogmas and depleted material resources. The Allies, having gone through the agonizing pain of mistakes and catastrophic defeats, managed to create a flexible, adaptive system combining science, industry, and the human factor into a single mechanism. This was a clash not just of armies, but of management systems. Democratic societies, despite their seeming unwieldiness and chaos at the beginning of the conflict, proved capable of mobilizing scientific and industrial potential far more effectively than the rigid, authoritarian war machine of the empire. Amiens proved that the individual heroism of a single soldier, however great, cannot withstand systemic superiority in technology, logistics, and coordination. The transformation of the situation on the battlefield occurred rapidly, as soon as the sun began to disperse the morning fog, revealing a picture of complete rout. What began as a tactical breakthrough on a narrow sector of the front turned, by midday, into a strategic catastrophe for the entire German grouping in the west. The coherence of the front was broken, and a huge, gaping breach tens of kilometers wide appeared in the defense, which was physically impossible to close. Reserve divisions, hastily thrown in by the German command to plug the gaps, fell under merciless airstrikes while still on the march, on roads clogged with refugees and retreating convoys, without even having time to deploy into battle formations. The crucial railway hub in Amiens, which the Germans had held under the sights of their long-range guns for months, threatening to cut off the main Allied supply artery between the French and British sectors, was completely freed from threat. Now, trains with reinforcements and ammunition could move unhindered to the very front line, further increasing pressure on the enemy, creating a snowball effect. The turning point in consciousness came when it became crystal clear. The German army was not merely retreating, performing a maneuver, but was losing its ability for organized resistance as such. The number of prisoners grew exponentially, reaching almost 30,000 by the end of the day, a figure unimaginable for a single day of fighting. At the same time, Allied losses in killed and wounded were surprisingly small by the standards of the Great War. This ratio spoke louder than any communiques. The enemy no longer wanted to die for the Kaiser. Captured staff maps, undamaged artillery, food depots, all this fell into the hands of the advancing forces practically without a fight. The cavalry, which had waited for its hour in the rear throughout the war, finally broke out into operational space, pursuing scattered groups of retreating soldiers, causing even greater confusion and panic. The climax of the battle did not come in the form of one epic hand-to-hand combat on a hilltop, but as a quiet, yet terrible realization of the irreversibility of the end in the offices of the High Command. At the headquarters in the city of Spa, where the brain of the German war machine was located, a deathly gloom reigned. Kaiser Wilhelm II, having received a detailed report on the events near Amiens, turned pale. His words, uttered in the circle of his inner circle, became the epitaph of the empire. We have reached the limit of our capabilities. The war must be ended. This was an admission of complete collapse, a moment when the political leadership finally heard what the battlefields had been silently screaming for several months. On the front line, the climax was expressed in a completely different picture. Allied tanks, having overcome the last line of German defense, emerged onto green, war-untouched field. Before them lay open France, not riddled with trenches, and this sight intoxicated the soldiers more than schnapps. The myth of an endless, static trench warfare was shattered. Movement, dynamism returned to the theater of operations, and this movement was inexorably directed eastward, towards the borders of Germany. The Amiens offensive did not end the war in one day. The guns still roared for 3 more months. But it deprived Germany of its last, most important hope, the hope for a stalemate, for an honorable peace. The significance of this event for military history and the fate of the world cannot be overestimated. It showed all humanity what the war of the future would look like: fast, technological, merciless to those who lagged behind in development and failed to adapt. The lessons of Amiens, carefully studied by military theorists in subsequent years, formed the basis of doctrines that would overturn the world 2 decades later. The paradox of history is that the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, was largely born here, on the fields of Picardy, when the Allies demonstrated the power of a concentrated tank strike supported by aviation. But it was the defeated Germans who would learn this lesson best of all, to apply it with terrifying effectiveness in 39 and 40. For Russia and Poland, whose borders and destinies were redrawn in the fires of revolutions and wars for independence at the same time, the experience of Amiens became a revelation of a different kind. The strategists of the future Red Army and Polish Army saw in this battle the prototype of a deep operation, a theory according to which a strike is delivered throughout the depth of the enemy's defenses, destroying his rear and logistics. Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Polish generals, who closely followed events in the West, understood that the era of positional warfare was over, that the future belonged to maneuver, to the engine, to speed. But an even deeper and more universal lesson lay in understanding that the morale of an army is not an abstract quantity, but a resource that directly depends on material support and faith in the competence of the command. As soon as a soldier understands that he is being sent to certain death with no chance of success against superior technology, the army ceases to exist as an organized force, turning into an armed mob. Today, looking back through the prism of a century at the events of August 1918, we see not just a successful military operation, but a turning point in the history of all Western civilization. Amiens became a symbol of the final transition from a romantic, chivalrous perception of war to a cold industrial calculation, where people become part of a mechanism. It reminds us that even the most powerful, seemingly eternal empires can collapse overnight if their foundation is undermined by internal contradictions, lies, and the inability to see reality as it is. The thousands of lives that were cut short on that foggy August day became a terrible price paid for this lesson. Their sacrifice paved the way for the end of the slaughter that claimed millions and led to the armistice signed in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest just 100 days after the offensive began. The fields near Amiens are peacefully green today, hiding under the grass and arable land the scars of the past, rusty shrapnel and the bones of the fallen. But the history written there in iron and blood remains an eternal warning about the fragility of peace and the destructive power of human genius directed at destroying its own kind. In the finale of our narrative, our thoughts return to the image of that morning fog, from which everything began. By noon on August 8th, it had completely dispersed, revealing not only the battlefield, strewn with smoking wrecks of machinery, abandoned cannons, and the bodies of those who did not survive that dawn, but also an entirely new geopolitical reality. The old world, a world of monarchies, epaulettes, and aristocratic officers, was living out its last hours, giving way to a new, cruel, and dynamic era, whose contours were outlined by the tracks of Mark V tanks and the wings of biplanes. The silence that descended upon the fields after the battle, when the cannonade shifted eastward, was no longer the tense silence of anticipation, but the silence of an outcome, a silence portending the end of a great tragedy. The British, French, Canadians, Australians, and Germans, all of them, each in their own way, understood deep down that day that there was no turning back to the past, nor could there be. The Battle of Amiens became that moment of truth, a bifurcation point when history took a sharp, painful turn. And the inertia of that turn is still felt by us today in every modern military doctrine, in every textbook of strategy. The world changed forever, irrevocably, and the catalyst for these tectonic shifts was a single day, which began precisely at 4:20 in the morning in the thick, impenetrable fog over a quiet French river.